Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Keith Brown, Deputy Leader of the Scottish National Party and former Economy Secretary in the Scottish Government. Elected as leader of the Scottish Conservative Party less than a year ago, currently an MP at Westminster, Douglas Ross. Anna Sarwar, as of 2 months ago, the new leader of the Scottish Labour Party and the UK's first Muslim and person of Asian descent to become a party leader. Canadian-born engineer and co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Lorna Slater, and 1 month short of his 10th anniversary as leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie. Good evening. Welcome to my guests here in the studio. Very good to have all 5 of you here. Very good. That's the first time we had 5 in the studio for a while, I'm pleased to say. Very good to see our audience, which is joining us from all over Scotland. We are in Edinburgh tonight. Very good to see you. And of course, thank you to you at home for joining us. And you can join in the conversation in the way that you know by now on social media at BBC Question Time. So let's hear what you've got to say and contribute to the debate. Our first question tonight is from Blair Wandin.
Hi there. If the May Scottish elections return a pro-independence government, what moral and legal right does the Westminster government have to deny another independence referendum?
Doug.
Well, I want to stop a pro-independence majority government. I want to stop the SNP having a majority at this election, as the Scottish Conservatives did 5 years ago. It was by people uniting behind the Scottish Conservatives that stopped that SNP majority in 2016, and people can do that again at this election. And I think it's so important because we're still coming through the health pandemic. We're still coming through the effects of COVID-19 that we've all been through and the restrictions for the last 12 months. And I really think we need a parliament that is focused only on our recovery, only on rebuilding after the last 12 months that we've all been through, rather than one distracted by another independence referendum.
And given that Boris Johnson has already said that he will not grant a second independence referendum, that's job done, isn't it? Why does anyone need to vote for you?
Because Keith Brown, as Deputy Leader of the SNP, launched their 11-point plan for another independence referendum and said they would ignore Westminster. If they didn't get a Section 30 order, which is the route that was taken in 2014, they would ignore that and hold a wildcat illegal referendum anyway, and that would bring uncertainty when we should be focused on our recovery. And I don't want that uncertainty in Scotland over the next 5 years when our Parliament has to be focused to protect people's jobs, to support the NHS, to rebuild our educational standards. All of these things would play second fiddle to a nationalist government who are only interested in separation.
Do you want that uncertainty, Keith?
I want that referendum, and the UK has no authority to prevent that referendum taking place if the people of Scotland vote for that, which was Blair's question. And I should say, in the issue of a wildcat referendum, the wildcat or renegade government in this country is the UK government. They've been taken to the Supreme Court, who struck down their decision to try and prorogue the UK Parliament. They've signed international agreements with the EU, which have immediately renounced afterwards.
Yes, but they haven't done anything wildcat about independence.
Well, I think trying to stop Parliament from meeting is pretty wildcat to me. And the simple fact is that the people who should decide if there's a referendum are the people of Scotland. So I don't think for a second Boris Johnson will continue to refuse to agree a Section 30 agreement, and it will be an agreement. We're not pleading for that. We want to have that. It's the best way to have the referendum. But he will not stand in the way of a referendum in Scotland if the people in Scotland vote for it.
Well, of course, he says he will do exactly that. Let's hear from some of our audience from Scotland. Nirana.
Shouldn't the Scottish government, and I want to ask Keith Brown, that take the power focus on power away from it and do welfare to Scottish population, which we need: education, health, industry, unemployment. All these problems are staring in our face. And that's the reason that the Scottish government, now the SNP, that the people would like to, people don't want to see another referendum.
OK, Nirana, thank you. Keith, do you want to answer that briefly before I move on?
If I can, I think this is a really important question. And it's important because this is a really, really important election. I've stood in every single Scottish Parliament election. This is easily the most important. So you have 2 paths. One is if the UK is allowed to go ahead, for example, with the ability to sign trade deals which then start to undermine our NHS. If they default, as Douglas has already done, to tax cuts and austerity as their way to deal with the recovery, that's not going to suit Scotland. This is our chance to make our own decisions. And if you don't exercise power over yourself, somebody else exercises power over you, and they do it in their interest and not in your interest. That's why we have to have the powers to have the right recovery for Scotland.
I'll come to you in a minute. I just want to hear a little bit more from the audience. Emma.
Hi there. I was previously an SNP voter, But basically, I feel like your whole manifesto has been overridden by the fact that we want independence. Personally, it took me off being an SNP voter, and I had to look at other options. I'm actually sat in my postal vote, so I don't really know. How can you convince me that another referendum is in the best interest of the country?
Okay, John?
I was curious to ask Douglas Ross. Blair asked a fairly straightforward question, and Douglas failed to answer it, as he does so many times. He just went off on a tangent about independence. Why don't you answer the question about if there's a majority in Parliament? Isn't that enough?
The question from Blair was about independence, which is why I answered about independence. But we hear from Emma, a former SNP supporter, saying she won't support the party now because they're putting independence above our recovery. What I'm saying as a Scottish Conservative is we can stop that. We can stop the uncertainty and focus on jobs, focus on recovery, focus on education, all the things we want to focus on in the next Parliament.
Willie?
Yeah, I mean, this country has been bitterly divided for, what, 10 years now, with arguments over independence, then over Brexit, and we've been through one hell of a year with the pandemic. I agree with Narinda when she says that we need to focus on the people who are waiting, for instance, over a year to get mental health treatment, people who have lost out on education for the last year. So what we need to do is to try and bring the country together. We won't get that with these two parties who are determined to feed off each other and the bitterness that's grown up over that period.
And why do you think more people aren't listening to your message?
Well, what we need to do is to try and bring people together, because we'll need the skills and talents of everyone in this country to get through this recovery. We won't do that if the country is divided by independence. And that's why I think it's most interesting that there are SNP supporters, who I've come across many of them, who are just sick to the back teeth of the divisions, and they want to come together for a change. We can put aside our differences for the next 5 years to try and unite the country to get through this recovery. We owe it to these people to do exactly that.
The Unionists want independence, the question of independence, to go away. Of course you want us to forget about independence and think about bringing the country together, but you can't sweep it under the rug.
Or concentrate on the recovery, which is what Nuala is
Thanks
saying.
to the Scottish Greens, we have had a parliamentary majority for independence all this last 5 years, and I fully expect that thanks to the Scottish Greens, we will have a parliamentary majority for independence this next parliamentary term.
To assume that you're going to win the election before anybody's voted.
The question is, what does that mean for who gets to decide on the recovery? So we've seen what, for example, Boris Johnson considers recovery. More nuclear weapons, a tiny 1% pay rise for nurses, that's essentially a tax cut, and buried, Rishi Sunak doesn't say it on the telly, but 8% cuts to public services. That is not recovery, that is grinding austerity, more grinding austerity. For recovery, there has to be investment, there has to be hope and opportunity, and that means looking at what kind of country we want to be and who gets to make the decisions about that country. And I think it's time we ask the people of Scotland again, who makes those decisions? The Brexiteer Tories in London or a government in Scotland that we've actually voted for?
I think what you've seen already tonight is a preview of what could be the next Parliament. We can choose something different. We can choose to recognise that COVID didn't choose between yes, no, leave and remain. The aftermath is not going to choose between yes, no, leave and remain. And whilst we've been separated from our families like never before, we've actually come together as a country like never before to confront COVID. And one of the things that I think is missing, particularly from the SNP and the Tories, is they somehow want to ignore the fact that this isn't an ordinary election. This is a pandemic election when 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives.
But what will you do, Anas, is if this election does return a pro-independence majority, will you just ignore
that's why,
that?
Fiona, I'm offering something different. I want us to choose something different and to have a different alternative.
But will you ignore that pro-independence majority?
I'm going to make the case.
Keeping us in the union isn't different. That's more of the same.
No, absolutely not.
We can do something
Lorna,
different.
The mistake that you make, and with respect Keith and to some extent Douglas makes, is that you want to pretend that somehow it's some kind of light switch moment that we can just decide to have a referendum and decide to have independence, and it's a light switch moment and it doesn't take years of focus. Brexit took 4.5 years of focus away from our country. Are we honestly saying that even in this midst of a pandemic, we can't come together for the sake of the national interest and focus on our recovery? Are we honestly saying when 360,000 of our fellow citizens are at home on furlough, worried about if and when they'll have a job to go back to. We're going to say, no, politicians want to go back to arguing with each other, and we want to go back to those old arguments. I think we can choose something different.
And we can,
I think we can
if
offer
we can
the
get
people
rid of that
something
threat
better
of an
than what the
independence
political
referendum.
bubbles offer them right
Because
now.
you rightly speak about the number on furlough. We know from the IFS, Institute of Fiscal Studies, are saying unemployment in Scotland could peak at 7.6% this year. Yet, Keith, you've said...
More than the UK.
Keith, you've said you want a referendum
but Douglas,
this year.
Douglas, you're right to say that about furlough, and you're right to say that about unemployment.
And if we can focus in on our recovery...
But the problem you have, Douglas, is that you are just as determined to talk about division as Keith and Lorna are. Because you all feed off division to suit your own political interest, not to suit the national interest. I would much rather we focus on what united us as a country rather than what divided us.
How is Brexit and Tories in Westminster in the national interest?
Lorna, you yourself have said that we've got to confront the climate emergency. We've got 9 years to confront the climate emergency, the very heart of your policies.
And
do you really want to spend 5 years of that 9 years arguing about independence?
Let's put aside things
do you really
we disagree on.
Hang on, if you talk at the same time, then I can't hear, neither can anyone at home.
Well, Anna said today, and it was manifesto, and it's a crucial point, this. Let's leave aside the things that we disagree on. We disagree on spending billions of pounds more money on nuclear weapons, on the two-child policy cap, on the rape clause, on the cuts that are coming from the Tories.
Something about it.
We disagree, and you cannot ignore those things, Anis. You have to front up to them if you want to form part of the government, or if you want to be seriously considered challenging it. The Tories are after the powers of the Scottish Parliament.
Let me give you an
Somebody has to
example.
stand up to it, and it's not going to be the Labour Party.
Well, let me give you an example, Keith. You've mentioned two policies right there. We have welfare powers in Scotland to top up any new benefit we wish and to create any new benefit we wish. With the bedroom tax. Why don't we use the powers we have? Why not focus on what we can do? You have been in government for 14 years.
You can't change the two-child
Nicola
policy.
Sturgeon has been First Minister for 7 years, and in that time the attainment gap has widened. Our NHS has gone backwards, not forwards, and we have seen our children's mental health suffer as a result.
Willie, I know you want to come back in. I'm just going to hear very briefly from the audience, and I'm going to come to you. Ryan.
Yes, I would just say in response to the point that was made by Keith regarding the question of independence, I would just simply say that it seems as if we have a very simple choice in the next Parliament, whether we spend it debating an issue that in reality was resolved almost 7 years ago. And I know that people will make the case that things have happened since then, but we were told at the time it was a once-in-a-generation vote, and we voted to stay part of the United Kingdom. And I just don't understand how, you can make the argument how we're going to recover from this pandemic, but at the same time, we're going to spend 2 years. I think it's now the SNP's proposals are now saying we're going to wait now till 2023. At least Alex Salmond and the Alba Party are saying they're going to just go on with it. They'd like to do one just straight after the election. I mean, I'd prefer none of it, but I'd go with that approach. It seems to be the better one to do. But I think that's a simple choice: recovery or debate stuff that we've already been debating for the last few years. And I just really don't see how this is going to change anything. I think we need a change in politics. I'd like to see a government of national unity working with each other and actually putting these old divisions aside and actually doing what's best for the country.
Well, we've only been on air for about 10 minutes, but by the looks of this, scant chance of that, from what I can see
but
here.
There is
Angela,
a chance of
hang
that.
on a second.
There is a chance
Angela, you've got your hand up.
So Narendra mentioned at the very start about focusing on the independence referendum or building the economy and recovering the health service. To me, they're not mutually exclusive. We can still have an independence referendum and still focus on these areas. SNP has seen a huge rise in NHS spending. We have the most GPs, nurses, midwives, dentists, and NHS staff per head across Britain. We have the best performing accident and emergency units. We have free prescriptions and eye tests. So to me, they are not mutually exclusive. We can still have an independence referendum and we can still focus on these key priority areas.
I mean, clearly there are other NHS statistics you could cite that aren't quite so favourable, but I hear what you say, Angela. Willie.
So, Fiona, let's take the issue of drugs. Scotland's got a terrible record on drug deaths. 1,256 people died. It's the worst in Europe. In fact, it's the worst in the developed world. It's 3.5 times what it is in England. And the confession from the First Minister was that through the independence debate, she took her eye off the ball. And we know from the previous Justice Secretary They didn't want to deal with the issue because it was too difficult and it might repel people for voting for independence at the time. Now, that's what we could have multiplied in the next 5 years. If the SNP and the Greens allow us to have a parliament that's focused on independence, many, many other things will be neglected. More people will die. This is real people's lives. We need to focus on dealing with the massive challenges we've got. We've got a climate emergency. We've got NHS waiting times that are as long as your arm. We've got an attainment gap that is as wide as ever. And we've got mental health waits, people waiting an age, young people waiting over a year. It's appalling. That's what we should be focusing on. We've got enough on our plate without arguing about more about independence. Let's bring everybody here together. There's a lot of talented people in the Parliament that could actually resolve things. We did it through the pandemic. We did some tremendous cross-party work on dealing with a massive challenge. I want more of that rather than more of the division that is inevitable. Even with the best of intentions of having a debate that's fruitful, we will have divisions, and the divisions will lead to us taking more eyes off more balls, and more people will lose their lives. This is very serious, and we do need to focus.
Doug.
We do, and that's where I believe we can, if we stop that SNP majority, focus on the recovery, on rebuilding, on drug deaths, on supporting the NHS, on rebuilding our educational standards. Scotland was once a world leader. It's now internationally average for education. And all these things we can do if we don't have the threat of a referendum hanging over us. And I just say to Keith, what do you think tonight, listening to Emma, as a former SNP voter, saying the SNP are only focused on another independence referendum? That's after 14 years you've been in power. You're offering nothing new to the people of Scotland other than more division with another referendum.
Absolutely untrue. And what would
that's what Emma's saying.
If I can just answer the question, Douglas, if Emma would like to look at the manifestos, you'll see there is a mention, of course, as a referendum, because we do think it's crucial to how we actually get through the pandemic. But the National Care Service, the increased funding for the NHS, the baby box continuing, the fact that we're going to have free school meals for every child and breakfasts and lunches for every child in primary school. There's a whole host of other stuff in there. And as has been said by Angela, we are achieving fantastic results in our NHS. Some tremendous things in education. There are difficulties as well, but there are tremendous things. It's not the case the two are exclusive. As Angela says, it's possible to do these things at the same time.
I think
there has been some joint working in the Parliament. There's no question of that. But the idea you ask people to set aside, first of all, the main route to get through the pandemic, to have the same powers as other countries, resources other countries have to deal with it, rather than wait, as we had to do over furlough, before it was a problem in the southeast of England, before furlough was granted again to England and Wales and Scotland. That can't be the way to deal with the pandemic. It is possible to concentrate on more than one thing at a time. And look at the Tories. They had the pandemic to deal with, and they had Brexit, and they went and pushed through a hard Brexit in the teeth of the pandemic. So I'll take no lessons from Douglas Ross about trying to do two things at once.
What about do you think they did both those things well, then?
No, I think it was appalling. And to go back to the point, that was made about the question of Brexit, in the referendum in 2014, we were told the only way to guarantee Scotland's place in the EU was to vote no. Well, people voted no, and it's been changed. We're being dragged out of the EU against their will. That is also one of the routes that we can have back to prosperity, a more equal and just country, if we get back into the EU and with the powers of an independent country.
But Keith, let's go back to talking about what you do have the power over. Willie mentioned drugs deaths. How many times during this pandemic has someone picked up the phone to call the crisis mental health service and the call has gone unanswered?
Well, you've obviously checked that.
25,000 times someone's picked up the phone and the call's gone unanswered. How many children are waiting over a year for their mental health support right now? 1,500 children missing out on mental health support and waiting over a year. How many undiagnosed cancers have there been in the last year? 7,000 undiagnosed cancers. You don't know the answer to those questions. You are in power for 14 years. And they are huge challenges.
You can answer some of these questions, Anis.
They are huge challenges.
How are you going to do this without the full powers of independence? Are you going to challenge the nuclear weapons? Are you going to challenge the UK government with the cuts? Or do you accept that Boris has got a veto over the things that we want to do to try and improve our country?
Are you honestly,
the two-child policy cap, the rape clause, are you going to challenge that?
Are you honestly going to be asked about cancer and talk about independence?
That is what you're
Are you honestly going to be asked about suicide and talk about independence?
Okay, wait a minute. One at a time.
Can I just clarify that, Fiona? Are you honestly saying that you're going to be asked about cancer and talk about referendums? You're going to be asked about suicide.
That's four questions
and you're
at
going
once
to answer
there,
about
the point I'm making is you
referendums.
want to give Boris
Why not
Johnson the
focus on
power
what you
to
have the
veto what
power
we have to
over?
do in order to approve, whether it's spending billions of pounds more on nuclear
Have you
weapons,
noticed there's a
whether
pandemic?
it's things like the rape clause. You're willing to say, let's put that aside and forget about it. I'm not, and the
Not at all,
SNP's
not
not.
at
We
all.
want a
But
better
what about
society
cancer care? What
than
about
Boris
suicide?
Johnson
What
will
about
give
drug
us.
deaths?
OK. Moira, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
It just amazes me how they're always saying that Scotland's worse off. If you look at England as a whole and other parts of the UK, I think Scotland does quite well with their health service. The vaccination programme is better. There may be a problem with drugs, but I don't believe that it's that much worse than in England. And we're always being talked about because the drugs problem is worse here. There's a lot more things worse. Homelessness, that's why there's so many people in the streets. What else have they got to turn to? They turn to drugs, but that's not just exclusive to Scotland, it's all over.
Well, just in terms of the drug deaths, the figures are considerably worse for Scotland, I'm afraid. That is just a fact.
And not just in the UK, but across Europe, the highest drug deaths anywhere in Europe. And we know that it has doubled since Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister 7 years ago. So when she says she took her eye off the ball, that has led to thousands losing their lives and families being ripped apart because of that devastation of losing a loved one so early. So we have to focus on drug deaths. We have to focus on education.
Are you going to repeal the Misuse of Drugs Act, Douglas? Because that stops us from having the powers that we need in Scotland to treat drug deaths as a social issue. We have an excellent history in Scotland of treating things like knife crime, things like minimum alcohol pricing for minimising the harm. But our hands are tied when it comes to the Misuse of Drugs Act because that is a UK law. It's out of date. The war on drugs has failed and it is...
Well, let's just hear from William.
I agree with you.
Sorry, let me just hear from William.
What is utterly depressing is that every issue, every single issue that exists has to be turned into a constitutional debate by these two people.
Because it would be better in an independent Scotland.
Answer the question. They turn it into a constitutional debate every single time and neglect their own responsibilities with the powers that they already have to do something about it. That's why we've got the highest drugs death rate in Europe. That's why we've got 380,000 people who've been waiting for the 18-week treatment guarantee, a law that was put in place. It's been broken that many times. That's why we've not met our cancer waiting time since 2013, the A&E time. We've not met that for years. All of these things on your watch, Keith. Yet your answer is, let's talk about independence. It's the best cover story that you've got. The reality is you need to focus on doing your job rather than looking for powers from somewhere else just because you don't want to talk about your failures in government. This is a failed government.
Those things can be true.
I'm just going to stop it here.
Unacceptable.
I hear what you all say, but I've got a number of questions I want to get through, so I'm going to move on. Forgive me. Let's hear a question from Alan Robertson.
Good evening. How does each party view the long-term future for oil and gas workers with plans to scale back production in the near future, given the number of people in Scotland who desperately rely on it, especially younger workers? And
Alan, you work in the oil and gas industry. What's your perspective?
Yes, I do. I work in the subsea sector, and we've had a number of challenges over the years, certainly in recent years, which has been exacerbated lately with the COVID-19 pandemic. But things seem to be stabling out a bit now. But of course, we now hear that the Green Party would like us to be ceasing production in the next 10 years and potentially working alongside the SNP to support a majority there. Which is obviously a worry because it's a concern for people who work in the industry, but also for further investment in the industry, which I think we need as a country. Can I come in on that one?
I absolutely understand your concern, and I share the same concern for workers in the oil and gas industry. I'm a renewables engineer. I'm an electromechanical engineer. I work for a company that makes tidal turbines. Our turbine launched today. It was excellent. The largest turbine in the world launched today from Dundee. It's on its way to Orkney. And this is how we manage the decline of the oil and gas industry. To tackle the climate emergency, to meet our legal requirements under the Paris Agreement, the oil and gas industry must decline. But that does not mean that we have to inflict hardship upon the people who work in that industry. The Scottish Greens would see a jobs guarantee for all oil and gas workers to make sure that they have jobs to move to in renewable industries, in other subsea industries. Scotland has 25% of all of Europe's offshore renewable energy. We have a huge amount of potential there, and I know that workers like yourself would be excited to work in a sustainable industry, an industry that has a long future, an industry that is on the cutting edge. And like with the turbine launch today, Scotland is on the cutting edge of renewables, and we would welcome you to come and join our industry with us, and let's work together to build a sustainable future for Scotland.
So you've hitched your wagon, not officially, but nonetheless you are supporters of the SNP in government. The SNP are not pledging to phase out fossil fuels within 10 years. So are you putting independence before climate change?
So we have no formal relationship with the SNP. We happen to agree with them on independence, but actually in many other policies,
you supported their budget,
there's a lot of
supported them in the Parliament.
Every
so I'm just
party
checking, so I
has
just
the
want to check,
opportunity
is
to
independence more
negotiate the
important to
budget.
you than climate?
The climate is the most important thing, absolutely. Number one thing, we have 9 years left to make fundamental changes to how our society and economy works. And you'll see in our manifesto that it is a plan for a fair and green recovery from the pandemic. We feel that independence is an important question to ask, because in order to implement the full suite of changes we need to build the economy we want.
Okay, no, you've made that point.
We can do more with independence, but that also doesn't mean we can't do more with the powers that we've got. Willie is right to some extent when he says we could do more. Those things can both be true.
Are you also going to pledge then to phase out fossil fuels within 10 years?
No, I think to go back to Alan's question, back in 2013-14, when there was a real crisis in the oil and gas sector in Scotland with a plummeting price, we instituted a number of revisions which allowed people to train out of those jobs into other jobs for that period. And I think what we now have to do is to ensure what people call a just transition, so that people that are actually working in that industry can find their way through into new employment opportunities. So we would pledge to do that.
Oil and gas production to stop, Keith?
Pardon?
When do you intend it to stop?
That's a good question.
Well, I do think it's very important that we should explore other avenues as well. So, for example, carbon capture twice could have been started by the UK government and they pulled the plug on it. So there are things which we can do to address the effects of taking those hydrocarbons out of the ground. But eventually we'll have to stop. Lorna's right. Climate change is an existential threat to the planet. We have to deal with this.
So
we should not be doing it at the expense of people that are currently in that industry. And whatever we do, we have to look after the families and the people involved.
Would you want to give us a time frame, Keith? Give us your plan.
I can't say specifically when it's going to stop. It will depend on the supply that's there just now, of course.
So there you see one of the massive gaps in policy between where the SNP and the Greens are. So we need to actually be practical about our obligations under the climate, under the Paris Agreement, and to deal with this existential threat. And this is a problem that I have with the SNP approach of setting targets and putting their hopes in things like carbon capture, when actually there are already practical technologies that work. Upgrading our rail system, investing in renewable technology, and upgrading our homes are all things we can do to reduce our emissions right away. No need to wait.
Douglas.
Lorna said Alan should be excited about the opportunities that the Greens would provide to him and his colleagues, and I didn't get from Alan's question that he was particularly excited about what the Greens would do in this next Parliament and the next two Parliaments to shut down production of oil and gas in the North Sea. Scottish Conservatives have been very clear. We want to protect the more than 100,000 jobs in Scotland that rely on that sector.
Well, Doug, you say in your manifesto, you say the North Sea oil and gas has a long future, decades ahead. Yet today, there is a huge global climate summit, and you've had Boris Johnson pledging to a big cut in carbon emissions. How are you going to keep those two things going in tandem?
Because the UK government has committed to a transition deal with the oil and gas sector, £16 billion to work with the experts and the people who have trained in oil and gas over decades to transition to greener forms of renewable energy. It's the first in the G7, but also Deirdre Meahy was writing in the P&J earlier on this week about the green plans. And it's not just 100,000 jobs in the North East and in Scotland, it's 270,000 livelihoods that rely on the oil and gas sector here in Scotland. And that's what we've got to protect, and that's what Scottish Conservatives are doing with our plans.
That's why we have plans to create 200,000 new jobs.
OK, we hear you. We've had lots from you, Lorna. Thank you very much. Let's hear from you, George.
Hi, I grew up in Aberdeen, so in 2014, the oil crash, I saw the impacts of it myself, and it was quite disastrous to the city as a whole, because even jobs which aren't directly within the oil industry get lost due to the crash and no money in the city. So if we don't do a transition now, or at least have a plan to transition into a greener economy, we could risk jobs which could be saved if we act now. And in general, I would say everyone on the panel, you were all arguing like back and forth independence, but for climate change, there's less shouting. So it's more positive to see but we just need to continue this into actual action rather than just words.
Jo?
Yes, I would just echo that. I think that this transition from oil and gas is inevitable. So why are we not looking at retraining and upskilling people into renewables now rather than waiting for the inevitable to happen?
Ruth?
Yeah, absolutely. What I do see is that there is a gradual training, which is a damn sight more than the Tories did when the pits closed. I saw precious little training going on for the thousands of miners who just got put out and hung up to dry. You know, I didn't see any Tories screaming about that.
I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you in Doug, but let me just get round the rest of the panel. So Labour's plans in terms of phasing out oil and gas?
Look, very fair
You've
point
made no
there.
particular pledges on that.
Well, look, we can only truly talk about a just transition if it takes communities with us. And if we decimate tens of thousands of jobs without a genuine transition to renewable jobs, that's not going to be a fair transition or a just transition. But there's actually a wider northeast economy point here, because Aberdeen and the surrounding areas is facing a crisis around oil and gas, but it's also got a crisis around the hospitality industry and a crisis around the tourism industry. There is a real economic crisis in the northeast, and this is one of the reasons why recovery is so important. When we talk about recovery, it just can't be a campaign slogan. It has to actually be a national mission, and the northeast is the perfect example of that. Unless we push power and resource out from our parliament into the different parts of Scotland so they can invest in individual sectors.
Yeah, but
for example,
Hannes, in fairness, I know this is what you want to make in terms of your
industry.
manifesto, but the question is very specifically, how do you view the long-term future of oil and gas workers?
Well, the long-term future has to be one in which we transition to a renewables future. But we've got to start that hard work now. We keep hearing about the Saudi Arabia of renewables. We heard it from Alex Salmond before. We've heard it from Boris Johnson now. We're hearing it now from the Scottish Government again. We've got to invest seriously and genuinely in those renewable jobs of the future so we can genuinely transition people from the oil and gas industry into renewables. That work is not happening. And BioFab was a perfect example of that.
97% of our fuel is fueled by renewables.
So what we need to do is we need to reduce the demand for oil and gas. That means making sure we change the heating in our homes. So we want to convert from gas, the heating in our homes, to things like air source heat pumps and other renewables. We want to make sure we have district heating systems that uses hydrogen, also hydrogen for transport. We need to make sure the tremendous potential we've got off the shore, Lorna's talked about it already, with the wind farms, the great opportunities there, huge resource. We need to make sure we exploit that potential as well. And if we reduce the demand, there won't, in time, be the need for the oil and gas reserves that we have in the North Sea. But then we'll have created the jobs, the thousands and thousands of jobs that will be created, populating all that work to make sure that we can reduce that demand. That's the step-by-step way. It's the hard graft that needs to be done in order to make sure that we can make this just transition real, because we can't afford to do a repeat of the 1980s. Where we just left communities in the lurch. And one, in fact, that I live in was left in the lurch with thousands of people unemployed for years on end, scarred for life. That cannot be done again. So we need to have this transition. And the transition is done by reducing demand, by using the new technologies to make full use of tremendous resources and the skills and the talents of people here. We should be able to create massive number of jobs if we do this right. A cavalier approach will not work.
I just think all the other parties are ignoring the fact this is already happening. The oil and gas sector are already taking part in this transition. We are taking them with us with the UK government £16 billion transition deal to make sure that goes further, to protect the jobs. But it's absolutely vital that people understand that's already happening in the North East and across Scotland right now, because it's being led by the sector, by the Oil and Gas UK, and by people like Alan who are doing the work right now.
OK, let's take another question. Doug Rennick.
The various party manifestos show a vastly differing spending promise. Can you please each explain the key sources for that fund of the spending do not involve a magic money tree? Thank you.
Right. Well, I've been having a close look at all your manifestos. It's been rather interesting reading. So, Anna, let's start with you. You're only giving spending promises for the first year.
No, look, what we're saying is that we have a national recovery plan, so we've deliberately switched our manifesto into two parts and made it a recovery plan rather than a party manifesto. It's a recovery plan.
But you've only provided costings for the first year, so how can anyone actually work out how you're going to find the money for the whole term?
No, so what we're saying is that the investment we need to make immediately in the economy and immediately around our public services needs to happen on day one. We can't wait for the virus to disappear before we start planning for our national recovery.
So when you have the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that there's no sense of how much your manifesto would eventually cost and how you'd pay for it, what's your answer to that?
Look, we've been very clear about what we do in terms of the immediate, in terms of our national recovery. So there are billions of pounds of unallocated recurring and non-recurring spend available to the Scottish Government after this election. I want to start spending that money straight away. Alongside that, I want us to build a new tax on online companies like Amazon. We should have an Amazon tax in Scotland so we can redress the balance between those online giants that made huge profits over the course of this pandemic and use that money to reinvigorate the high street and get people back to work.
So Willie, looking at the Lib Dems manifesto, as far as I could see, it's not really costed at all. I had a little count, and in the entire 52 pages, there are only 18 pound signs.
Okay. No, we have costed our manifesto.
Have you? How? I couldn't find it.
No, well, we've costed it, and we can make the costings available to you if you wish. But what we've gone on is the central...
So the costings are private, are they? They're not there for everybody to see?
No, we've shared them with journalists. So we've...
No, you've not, Willie.
No, we've gone for the...
You've not.
No, we have.
Or not with the IFS. So I just want to press you on that, because we looked through your manifesto.
We discussed with the IFS yesterday. We've shared the costings with them. I'm not quite sure.
So when we look at your manifesto, and you've only... there's no actual reference to exactly how you pay for things.
Well, let me explain. I'll explain. So we've gone for the central estimate of the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy. We've committed £1 billion of extra spending. That's for things like 3,500 permanent teachers to make sure that we increase the spending on the NHS, the mental health spend of £400 million. The £2.5 billion on top of that billion is for the NHS. And then we've left plenty headroom to be able to afford an increase in pay for social care workers.
So where's it going to come from?
Also, well, the medium-term financial strategy, which is a cautious document, which has been based on the work from the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Fiscal Commission in Scotland.
So it's not a magic money tree, but where's it going to come from?
Well, I've explained. It's the medium-term financial... It's roughly the same approach that the Scottish Government has taken in terms of picking the central estimate, and it's allowed for plenty of headroom to be able to afford unexpected events over the next period. So believe me, it is well affordable, because I am determined to make sure that everything we promise is affordable and deliverable. We are not going to overpromise. It's cautious, it's got plenty of headroom, and it means we can do things like making sure that we're going to get those 1 million heat pumps in people's homes. Okay. It's make sure that we can employ those extra teachers so we can get bounce back support in education, and that we can make sure we can get a recovery in the NHS, dealing with all these massive weights that people have got to deal with.
Lorna, looking at the Greens manifesto, I was a bit puzzled, because you're planning to increase taxation using powers that you don't actually have at the moment, that you would only have if you were an independent Scotland, like wealth taxes, for example. So how's that going to work?
Well, that's an interesting discussion that we would like to have with the government in Westminster. The government in Westminster has said that they are wanting to invest and look at the taxation system, so hopefully we could work with them. I mean, if we're looking
just to be clear, you're wanting to raise money through taxes that you don't actually have the power to raise money with at the moment.
Option A. Option B...
Well, it's not an option at all at the moment, is it? Well, you don't have those powers.
If the Westminster government won't work with us, we would like them to work with us on this. I mean, we're not an independent country yet. If we're really talking about the UK working together as a whole, maybe, and if they want Scotland to, if they want to show Scotland how good that is. But the plan B would be to do it using local taxation powers, but we'll have to wait and see how open Westminster is to working with Scotland on a joint recovery. I mean, it would be a very interesting thing. In terms of also paying with it, not only would we ask for the wealthy to help contribute. For example, those companies who have done so fantastically well, who've made billions off of the pandemic, I think it's a one-time windfall tax would be reasonable to help the country recover. But we would also, expect the wealthy to pay more. We've got to rebalance the inequalities.
So you want to raise taxes? Okay. Debbie.
Hi there, good evening. I'm just wondering how the Green Party can justify the increase through taxation when part of their manifesto is looking towards moving to a 4-day working week. Surely people need to earn more money to raise additional taxation.
That is an excellent question, and thank you very much for asking it. So the kind of taxes that we're looking at are windfall taxes on massive corporations and, for example, a wealth tax on people who have assets of over £1 million.
So again, this is the tax you'd have to get the government the UK government to agree to
That's
hand
what-
over
that's-
to you,
so we're
but at the
not-
moment you don't have that power.
We're not talking about taking pounds out of ordinary people's pockets.
Okay.
We're not talking about increasing taxes on your work. In fact, we believe that for the economy to function well, we have to put money into people's pockets. And that's why we would support things like a universal basic income, for example, doubling child payments. So this is about the very, very wealthy paying a little bit more, not ordinary people.
So, Doug, you want to cut business rates and lower taxes. How
For
are you
the
gonna-
rich.
How are you going to pay for everything?
So Doug's point
Where's your magic money,
is crucial because Scottish Conservatives are the only party in this election who, with our manifesto, published our full spending commitment.
No,
we have set that.
That's
Well,
not true.
Keith.
That's not
oh,
true.
come on.
You know it's not
you
true.
cannot
Doug,
say...
Fully costed.
Well, it's absolutely not. If you think your manifesto is fully costed...
Well, maybe you should read it first.
It's going to cost more than double
It's
the
right here.
current Scottish budget. So that's typical
just a
fancy
nonsense.
economics from the SNP. But in terms of our plans, it's focused on recovery, it's focused on investing, it's focused on supporting the NHS. IFS say the Scottish Conservative plans are the most generous for the NHS out of all the parties
But where are
in
you
this
going to get the
election.
money from?
So what we're seeing, for example, there's £4.8 billion of unallocated capital spend in the Scottish Government at the moment. We need to get that money out. So that drives our infrastructure growth right across the country, be it full fibre broadband, be it investing in more house building, the most ambitious social housing building programme since devolution that the Scottish Conservatives are putting forward. And then we have said, only at the end of the Parliament, if we can rebuild our education system by recruiting 3,000 additional teachers at a cost of £550 million over the course of the Parliament, we would look to get parity back in the tax system if it is possible, because 1.1 million Scots currently pay more tax right now for doing the exact same job than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. 1.1 million.
I want to hear
penny more for those at the bottom.
I just want to hear a little bit more from our audience. Shelley.
Hello, I'm Douglas Ross. I'm struck by the various areas that you say for investment, but I don't hear you talking about people. I'm not hearing you talk about communities.
Well,
the people who have been the most hit, I would say, are the disadvantaged. We're expecting a huge homelessness spike and a peak. How would you kind of see that the investment where you're going to place it is going to respond to any of those issues?
No, it's a great point, Shelley. That's why we want to build 60,000 new social homes in the next Parliament, the most ambitious social housing project since devolution. That's why we want to roll out full fibre broadband by 2027, because one of the biggest things that we've seen during this pandemic is people not being connected with friends and loved ones. Why are we still in 2021 struggling with good Wi-Fi signals in many parts of Scotland? That's the type of investment that can connect people and communities all over again.
But Douglas, why do you think it's a priority to give you and me and Annis and Keith and Lorna a tax cut? Why do you think that's a priority?
I am happy not to accept that, but I would like to give it. I'd like to give it to 1.1 million people in Scotland.
You're obviously embarrassed about it.
No, I'd
That's
love
why you're
to
not
give
going
it.
accept
I'd love to give it to the teachers,
Come
to the police officers in Scotland. 1.1 million people in Scotland who pay more tax here for doing the exact same job than anywhere else in the United
pay less
Kingdom.
tax. Most people in
No,
Scotland
Scotland
pay less
is the
tax
highest tax part of the United Kingdom.
because most people in Scotland are in the lower band that pay less tax. Some people in Scotland pay more tax.
Okay.
The people who are, but most
Well,
people,
let's get back to the question from Doug, which is how your various manifestos show vastly different spending promises. How can you explain how you'll fund it all? So you say your manifesto is fully costed. I had to look through that as well. There's some things I couldn't find. Maybe I missed them. How much is free dental care going to cost?
It depends exactly on the agreement reached with the BDA, but it could be
But how much do you think it will
around about £137 million.
And where's that going to come from?
That's going to come from the budget that we have. Willie mentioned before that the basis for drawing up budgets in the Scottish Government is a central, an optimistic, if you like, and a less optimistic estimate. We've taken the central estimate, as Willie appears to have done, to calculate. So you know the money that's going to come in from Scottish taxpayers giving money to the UK Exchequer and the money we get back, and also from the Scottish taxation system, which is both more progressive and less onerous than the UK system. If I can come back to Douglas's point, he said that his is the only costly manifesto. He couldn't answer the question where the £600 million of cuts in the NHS was going to come from.
No, come on,
and if
Keith.
I can just say, you had your answer.
If you can answer that point.
Just let Keith make a point and then you can answer it.
And if it's the case that he can't answer basic questions like that, and yet he accuses Nicola Sturgeon of taking their eye off the ball, which ball is he going to be? He's going to be First Minister, he's going to be an MP, he's going to be an MSP, and he's going to be a referee. Which ball are you going to be looking at when you drop the budget?
Keith, I'm sure someone wrote that for you this afternoon and it looked great on paper, but we're speaking about your party's manifesto that is not costed. and you're asking about our £600 million investment to catch up on all the delayed appointments and treatments within the NHS. It's a priority within the NHS right now, and every single party
Where's
here...
the money coming from?
We have
identified it.
We've got the most generous...
Savings, you've said.
No, absolutely not, Keith. It's clear that we are going to focus that £600 million on catching up the delayed appointments and treatments and operations.
Have you not said that's going to have to come from within the existing NHS budget?
Yes.
So what will you have to cut to find that 600?
So what we said is during the pandemic, the UK government have provided the Scottish government with an additional £13.3 billion to deal with the pandemic. We want to use that money, £600 million of it, to give it to the clinicians, rather than the government saying how to spend that to catch up. But every party is saying we've got to catch up on missed operations, delayed treatments. So how are you paying for it?
Well, I tell you what, we've got a question. Hang on, we've got a question on health. So let's hear from our questioner. Jude, you're sitting there very patient in your beautiful blue room, incidentally. Let's hear your question.
Thank you. Is the NHS in Scotland ready for the task ahead to meet the needs of our patients, including COVID rehabilitation?
Right. So, Keith, I know you want to come back. Willie, I'm going to start with you. You've talked about drug deaths already. Let's look at other areas of the NHS.
So, at the core of this, we've got a mountain of mental health waits. We've got a mountain of people who are waiting for the operations, the appointments. And what we need to do is to use some of the new technologies and new ways of working that we've developed through the pandemic to make sure we can deal with this backlog as quickly as possible. We've got £2.5 billion of extra funding that's going to be committed to the NHS over this period. That means they'll have the finance. But at the heart of this, we need to deal with the problem that pervades much of the public services, which is our mental health problem. We're not training any more psychiatrists and psychologists than we did 5 years ago. We need to have mental health first aiders in every single workplace so we can reduce the demand on the NHS. We also need to make sure that we're deploying the mental health counsellors that are in the community to be able to take the load off there as well. So that will help significantly. We also need to localise health services because people have got used to health services being much more local, whether it's using a technology or in their local centre. We need to make sure that the specialists are available at a local level, again to reduce the demand, to do the preventative work, so that we can actually get the NHS back on track. This has got to be one of our top priorities because we need to invest in our NHS to make sure people get the treatment that they need on time.
So Jude's question, Keith, is the NHS in Scotland ready for the task ahead? Just looking at the funding again, we've got the election coming up, obviously. Why are you promising a smaller increase in funding than the UK government?
Well, we've said very similar to what Willie just said, £2.5 billion. And I think it's also true to say we start off from a higher per head expenditure on health services in Scotland.
But so why are you promising a smaller increase in funding?
But what we've also said is if there are further consequences that come, we will allocate that to the health service. So I don't think it's possible to be definitive about what the what the UK does from a lower base compared to what Scotland does. And as the point
nonetheless, I'm just thinking it is a smaller increase in funding. There's no getting around that.
Well, there is actually. If the consequences...
Well, it's 2.1% versus 3.4%.
I think those figures are disputed. The UK figures are disputed by experts. But if we put the £2.5 billion in which I've mentioned, and if in addition to that there are consequential monies, then it could be the case that the increase is even greater. Plus, as Willie rightly says, we also have an additional commitment to mental health services, and also to the point he made about a link worker, for example, in every health centre. So there are additional expenditure. I mean, what we want to do is, by the time of the end of the next Parliament, have 1/10 of the entire NHS budget going towards mental health because of some of the problems. But can I just say the NHS, I think, has done a fantastic job through the pandemic. They are tired, doubtless, but they've done a fantastic job.
Well, let's hear from someone who works for the NHS, who happens to be in our audience. Pippa, you're a junior doctor, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was referenced earlier, the idea of a national care service, and my experience over the last year is that that's one of our main problems, not having safe and available places to discharge elderly and frail patients to. They're not always benefiting from acute admissions to hospitals, and then they get a bit stuck, and in hospital they're at risk of hospital-acquired infections, including COVID. And I think that's got to be one of the main points for discussion when we're discussing if moving the health service in Scotland forward.
And Judith?
Yes, thank you.
I work in the biotech industry, and I would say the healthcare system in Scotland, or in the UK for that matter, is not prepared for what is coming. There is a tsunami of conditions that are coming our way. I work in particular in Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's disease was a leading cause of death in the UK up until COVID took over, but recently with the decline in COVID deaths, Alzheimer's disease has once again taken that unfortunate top spot. But there's a number of diseases, whether it's chronic neurological diseases or neurodegenerative diseases, consequences of cardiovascular disease, which is still growing, cancers, which are still an issue. And then we're dealing with the mental health issues. And we're also dealing on top of that with the diseases that haven't been adequately treated during the COVID pandemic, because so many resources have been directed towards COVID, and patients have been told, are been afraid to go see their doctor, no matter whether we've told them to come, they haven't. And we're going to see more pandemics. So I just see all of these trends happening, and I'm not convinced we're doing enough about it.
Okay, Anas.
I think Judith and Pippa are both right. Our NHS staff have gone, and social care staff have gone above and beyond over this pandemic. But the reality is they were overworked and undervalued even before the pandemic. And we had a huge backlog on care around cancer, around missed and cancelled operations, around mental health, even before the pandemic. And they have now been exacerbated by the pandemic. And the only way we're going to address these issues is fundamental, yes, investment. That's investment in terms of capital infrastructure. It's changing the way we do healthcare. But it's
and
also
on
about
investment, Anas, you're pledging to spend even less than the SNP?
No, not at all.
In the first year?
No, not at all. So what we're saying is...
350 million versus 500 million?
So what we need is rapid diagnosis centres. But we're not going to build the physical buildings in those rapid diagnosis centres in the time of weeks and months. So let's get temporary facilities up and running right now.
But just to be clear,
so
in the first year, are you saying you're pledging to spend as much as the SNP?
So what we're saying is there's much more longer term capital investment.
Oh, so it's this long term that we don't know
about.
No, in the first year, it's not as much.
No, I want us to start that work straight away in terms of building that capital infrastructure, but it's going to take time to get that capital infrastructure into place. But we can't afford to wait.
So I think that's a no.
No, we can't afford to wait for the buildings to be built before we start catching up on the screening programmes. So let's invest in the workforce. That means increasing the level of the workforce. It means doing things differently. That involves paying our NHS staff better as well as our social care staff.
Wage increase,
so we want a £12 an hour pay increase for social care staff, rising to £15 an hour over the course of the next Parliament. We want a mental health worker in every GP practice. We want rapid diagnosis centres. We want to prioritise on mental health. Keith talks about the budget. We currently spend 8% of our budget on mental health. The UK average is around 11.5%.
I need to get around the rest of the panel,
and also
forgive me, or they won't have time to speak. Doug.
So our NHS staff and social care staff have gone above and beyond over the last year, and they are going to continue to do so. And what we've heard from both Judith and Pippa...
So why did you refuse to back the SNP proposal of a 4% increase in NHS pay? I mean, you've now done a U-turn, I think, and you now do support it.
No, it was never a U-turn. We were being asked totally different questions, but we are clear...
Well, you said you'd wait for the pay review. There hasn't been a pay review, but you do now support the 4%.
I absolutely support the 4%, but it's still out for consultation, and it'll be after the election before we understand the outcome of the ballot that will be taken on that. But we do have to support our NHS and social care staff, because it's not just the last year that's been so difficult. The next year is going to be really difficult. That's why we want to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in the next year to catch up, because people were waiting a long time for appointments and operations before COVID hit, and many of them were just getting ready to go into hospital for urgent operations, hip replacements, just as COVID hit, and now they've been left another year waiting. And I say again, the IFS have said the Scottish Conservative plans for the health service and funding for the health service are the most generous in this election, because we can see that's where the priority is. That's where the priority is for everyone speaking on the call tonight, because they want to get us to catch up on operations, on treatments that have been missed, on appointments that have been delayed, and that's why we need to invest over the next year.
Lorna.
I think Judith described very clearly three of the long-term trends that we've seen in healthcare in Scotland and indeed in the UK that I think are concerns: increase in mental health problems, problems with not having care places to put people in that have, led to the sort of bed blocking and that kind of problems, and chronic health problems that we see that really are a result of poverty and inequality. So we've all talked about the kind of acute issues, addressing the immediate issues of COVID, but let's also look at the bigger picture and look at restructuring our economy, because those are all things we can do about we can do something about. We can work together cross-party to build a national care service to stop that bed blocking, to lift the pressure on the NHS. We can work together to alleviate poverty in Scotland, to implement fair policies, living wages, a universal basic income, affordable housing so that people don't suffer from that kind of grinding poverty. And things like reliable income, fair work, knowing that you're going to have the money at the end of the month to pay the bills, that goes a long way to alleviate the kind of mental health crisis that we do see in Scotland. So alleviating of poverty goes a long way to doing those things. Good work, fair wages, all these things go a long way to that, and so will the National Care Service. All of this is part of rebalancing our economy, and I look forward to getting to work on it.
Jude, you asked this question. What do you think of what you've heard?
Yeah, I would welcome, of course, any solid investment and commitment to community-based rehabilitation services. I think the investment is a genuinely important element. I also think we should be aiming for a joined-up approach across acute services and community services. We need to have a multi-professional approach to this, and we need to really support these patients right across their journey of rehabilitation. The 2009 NICE guideline tells us that we need high quality rehabilitative services for any patient suffering a serious illness, and that includes COVID. And I believe that we have the staff, allied health professionals, we have these staff with the skills to be able to work across a range of, to meet a range of patients' needs, including physical and mental health. And I feel we just need that joined up approach, but also the investment that comes along with it.
And Lynn, you've had your hand up throughout.
I actually was going to say something very, very similar. I get really frustrated listening to politicians talk about what health needs and to quote statistics and figures. I work with young people and I can't echo more the need to see health holistically tied up with that whole development of people, especially young people. How many problems and health issues could we prevent?
And do you think you're seeing that from many of the politicians you've got here today?
I'm disappointed, if I'm honest. I'm disappointed.
Okay, Ryan.
So,
yeah, I would just say that I just find it kind of not overly surprising, but just amazing that the same people who have for the last year voted for these really tight restrictions on our civil liberties and freedoms then discuss how they're going to fix the problems that have been caused by those laws in place. And I know that the response will probably be that we'd no alternative, but this has been a year now. We've had a year to really think about things.
Now, I'm sure you'd all like to come back in on that, but I'm afraid our time is up. Ryan, thank you very much for your point, and of course to all of you in the audience, to my panel, thank you very much for coming here this evening, appreciate it very much, and of course to you at home for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.
Bloody hell, I was surprised I didn't get kicked off. Wow, that was interesting. It's me thinking, I'll just give it a try. I might get kicked off in like 5 minutes. It lasted the entire bloody show. That's mad. Because last time I streamed afterwards, it kicked me off. Mind you, it was the next day. Maybe there was some of the shit on there. Someone claimed that. I don't fucking know. But anyway, it wasn't as bad as I thought. I knew the independent shit would come up. That was boring as fuck. As usual. But the rest of it was interesting, I suppose. It weren't that bad. Anyway. Oh well. I will see you Sunday, I think. Yes, Sunday. Andrew Marr and what's it called? Dateline London. So Saturday will be Sunday even. I don't know if I'll be up Sunday morning, so you know if I'm awake, I'll stream it when it's on. But otherwise, it'll be probably in the afternoon or some shit. But now, I'm going to have a lovely game of Counter-Strike, I think. Yeah. I've been on bloody... You know why I'm late? I was busy playing World of Warcraft and I literally forgot the time. I was grinding my hunter and I was like, shit, question time. Fuck, forgot. So yeah, that's why I'm late. Anyway, I'll see you all on Sunday. Enjoy the rest of your night or daytime or whatever part of the planet you live on or whatever. Tickety boo.